I'll share with you is our most recent example of the work we were doing for our second cycle of the Universal Periodic Review. I was fortunate enough for the first cycle to be the coordinator in Geneva for the U.S. Human Rights Network. And the U.S. Human Rights Network is over 300 NGOs in the United States, from community groups all the way to international ones such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, that all joined together to make sure that our first UPR was a success and that we were able to coordinate as one unified unit. And that worked out quite well in the first cycle. And I was fortunate to be the one that organized the work that we did when we came to Geneva. And then on the second cycle, I've just been appointed to be the co-chair of the UPR task force. So I'm responsible to work with my colleague Mary Garish from Vermont, and we're supposed to bring all of civil society together to create a task force, bringing together all the important NGOs, but then more importantly turn in all our reports and to bring in other issues that we didn't focus on. In our first cycle, we actually had 26 thematic working groups, and interesting enough, we didn't have one on human rights education in the first cycle. One of the things we were working, of course, in the first cycle was there were so many issues to bring up and deciding what was a priority, and at that point the human rights educators and the teachers didn't come together when we put out a call across the nation, and it just never came together in that way. Nonetheless, in the second cycle, we tried to learn. We also realized we had not spoken to the youth as much, so we actually didn't have youth featured as well. But interesting enough, we organized this time to do UPR consultations in high schools and universities and get the youth perspective on all the issues of what's going on and put the UPR in the context of how it applied to them. More importantly, and for the sake of my brief presentation today, we focused on the human rights educators across the country. So it actually was a good example of how things don't happen unless you really work. I'm part of the Human Rights Educators USA, but I actually had to go and meet with the board and convince them that they should do the Universal Periodic Review. So I first sent a nice email, hey, this is coming up, what do you think? No response. Then I knew one or two of the key people most people know, Nancy Flowers and Felicity Tibbetts, who's mentioned here. They do human rights trainings all over the world. I said, hey, long time no see, what do you think, could we meet? And Felicia was just finishing up her doctorate at Columbia University at the Teachers College. So she said, okay, let's meet in New York. So I said, great, I'm at the UN, I'm doing the Indigenous meeting and a couple other things. So we met at the Millennium Hotel in the lobby, and it was like, okay, we have an hour, tell me why UPR would be important to human rights teachers. And it's not something you think you actually would have to do, but to give a speech to educators and explain to them why they should be involved in the UPR actually did take a certain amount of convincing. You had to explain what the UPR is. I explained the 5 steps. And then I explained how there were only so few recommendations on human rights education, but it's a great opportunity to actually grow human rights in the country. And then most importantly, I said, you actually don't do the work, and this would be a great opportunity to bring all the educators together around a common issue of the UPR, but then get on the same page for all of the 50 states, but also there's nothing at the national level really being done. So it's something that people actually realize is, well, one of the problems with human rights education is none of us know what's really happening in our own country. So the UPR is a great time to take stock of what do we have and how far do we really have to go, and why human rights education would be important in transforming our country. So that was the first thing I had to do was meet with her for 1 hour. Fortunately, she agreed. She thought it was great. Then we had to convince the rest of the board. We had to do an hour Skype conference call. And I'll never forget, I remember one city, they said, we don't need this. We already have everything. And I was like, wow, that's phenomenal, because I've never seen anything about your city having anything with human rights education, and I think you just had a shooting yesterday in your high school, you know, so no reason. But of course with peace educators, it does no good to argue. You have to just say, excellent, no problem. Love to visit your city, lovely city, and see how human rights education is done. Others agreed, and so we decided to come up with 3 consultations. We first met in San Francisco in July. In July, actually on the 26th of July, when the UN Charter was adopted, we had a meeting in San Francisco. We had educators all come together at the Amnesty International office in San Francisco, just like the nice presentation you had this morning. And what we just did was discuss. We talked stories. What's the best model of human rights education? What needs to be done? What would you really dream and desire? If you could have funding wasn't a problem and support of your administrators wasn't a problem, what would you do? And you could really see after we did it for 4 hours, and they were just like, we just haven't even started this process. But that's the point of the UPR. It is a great tool to force people to begin to organize and to assess and to coordinate. So that was the first one in San Francisco. Then we had 2 in New York City in 2 evenings. Interesting enough, the educators and the NGOs and the administrators that met were willing to stay an extra hour and a half on Wednesday and Thursday evenings. So those went great. And then the final one we held at Harvard in Boston. And at that one, we did it all morning and we finalized this report. So that's kind of how the process worked out. But they also did online surveys. Many faculty said, I don't have time to go meet, but I'll fill out the survey of what they wanted to do. So 120 people filled out the survey. And in any sense, what it really was for the work that I do on UPR was actually just an excuse to reach out to other educators and see what everybody's doing. You'd meet all these people who actually had really good things, but you never knew they were doing it. There's a mayor right outside of San Francisco that has a Universal Declaration of Human Rights contest for high school students. No one's ever heard of it. And so we just were able to at least come up, and you'll see through here some of the best practices and what everyone could at least use, and just to network together to come up with things, if we don't have a national approach, how they can learn from one another. In the first cycle, we did do sub-lobbying here in Geneva, and we ended up getting 3 recommendations. Recommendation number 86, you can read there, was looking at combating stereotypes and violence. Recommendation 87 was incorporating human rights training and education strategies and public policies. So that was very important there for us to begin to look at that at all levels, to infuse human rights education into the formal education sector. And then the last one was avoid the criminalization of migrants and ensure the end of police brutality, human rights training, eliminating stereotypes, and guarantee the incidents of excessive use of force be investigated and the perpetrators prosecuted. So it was looking at those 3 recommendations and taking those and not coming up with new ones that we wanted, but let's just see how the U.S. is doing on that. So I think if we're using Gloria's system, there'd be a lot of red lights. I don't think there'd be too many green, as you can see with the recent killings. But it was important for us to look at that. But there's a lot of things that came out. The first thing was to focus on what the U.S. should ratify. We've only ratified 3 of the core 10. Also, we don't really focus on the UN World Program for Human Rights Education. And of course, as Monique talked about, the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, they have not utilized that enough, so we pushed for that. But more importantly, we noted there's no comprehensive national framework or action plan on human rights education, or a National Human Rights Institute with a mandate to provide and ensure quality human rights education, or a focal point at a national level. So these are some of the things that we're looking at. And here's some good things that came out that people just didn't know before. So the first one, the federal government lacks coordination, leadership, and oversight in supporting states' implementation. Noted that. And here's where it got into good information. We actually tracked every state. So all the human rights educators actually had to find the same information. But we noted only 39 of 50 states mentioned human rights education in their social studies standards. And among them, only 22 contained the UDHR. So that's absolutely crucial. And if I would ask any of you if you even know how your states match up, or if they, but the point is no one knew until we actually did this, and they wouldn't have done it if the UPR wasn't coming up, because they say they're so busy grading papers and doing everything else we're doing as educators. So it was a great excuse for me to be able to get educators to focus, to use the UN, but to use the UN to make sure we're better organized in a country. The other thing we pointed out is everything is through a historical lens. If you talk about human rights, it's ending slavery back then, or the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. I love talking about the I Have a Dream speech. But we're trying to say it's every day today and what we could do. It's not a dream in the past, it's most relevant to students for their careers, what they want to do in their daily lives. Change that. And then the other one was looking at, since it was predominantly historical, it didn't facilitate the connections between human rights responsibilities and personal behaviors. There's social and emotional learning, critical thinking, making connections, and learning about international affairs. So that turned out to be really good. There's a lot that I could go over, but I really want us to have more times for discussion. And I think many of you also have great examples you can share with me. But just some of the examples they have here is what Massachusetts does, what New York does. Minnesota has a social studies standard that requires 8th grade students to assess the state of human rights around the world as described in the UDHR. Understanding and applying those principles in their daily life, which is pretty good. Rhode Island contains the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we haven't ratified. Arizona asks students to describe world governmental and NGOs, the UN and its agencies. So these are things that at least we can all look at, wow, what state had the best language, and what could we use in our state so that we can make sure that at a state level that was actually achieved. So that worked out really well. They also talked about there's no training programs and how we had to do that better. Then best practices, they had a couple numerous pages of other great things that we did. School environment, looking at the issue of bullying and organizing at that level. And then the final part is always important, as we talked about on Wednesday in both of our groups, is the recommendations.